Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. I almost forgot to read this book when I was preparing to get my live stream ready for Valheim. Let's also open this curtain a little bit, let some light in. There we go. That should make it a little bit easier. And we can get to this. So, last time we left off, we were basically coming up to chapter 4.7 by the looks of it. So, let's do this. Chapter 4.7, World War III. In the context of a looming World War III, the financial trap should perhaps be a lesser concern. But in fact, they're both related. It's because the economies of the West are going to implode that we could predict World War III would be started as a distraction and a transition, or as a transition to a new form of financial repression. As of late, stroke number one, as of late November 2023, people laughed at us for saying World War III was around the corner. I feel a trend here going on. In the first minute, I'm having a stroke. Anyway, we will show you that the oligarchy has been knowingly discussing this in public for almost 30 years. The oligarchy in the West began fomenting the conflict in Ukraine for many years before 2022, and using the most corrupt country in Europe. The West is being slow-marched into World War III. As far back as 1997, Biden was making speeches, public ones that is, on how NATO encroaching on the border of Russia would be sure to provoke Russia. When the National Socialist coup took over Ukraine in 2014, Biden was there. In 1997, Gorbachev, the final president of the Soviet Union, televised public warnings of the US Congress about the military threat if NATO moved closer to Russia's borders. In 2001, Putin warned against NATO expansion to the borders of Russia. In early 2008, the USA ambassador in Moscow sent a classified telegram later released by WikiLeaks, stating, and I quote, I need a moment. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which could seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split, involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. End quote. So the US ambassador to Moscow was warning the US government and NATO command that the actions they were undertaking would provoke a civil war in Ukraine, and yet the peace-loving West went ahead and provoked that civil war. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Germany was Russian-speaking Angela Merkel, who said Russia would view this NATO expansion as a declaration of war. Putin warned Ukraine in 2008 if the country joined NATO, then Russian missiles would target Kiev. Putin saying, I am not only terrified to utter this, it is scary even to think that Russia would have to target its offensive rocket systems at Ukraine. The oligarchy rely on their compliant mercenaries in academia and the media to ensure the public either do not see or do not remember that these warnings were made. And this is the first time I'm hearing about this as well, so it actually is quite sobering that, hell, Putin didn't want to do this. Like, that to me really does paint a very clear picture of just how treacherous our far left-wing political establishment truly are. They really are a sinister bunch of cunts, aren't they? Anyway, in 2014, in an interview on Switzerland's state TV, Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, warned explicitly that the West was provoking World War III. They want us to get used to the idea of a new war, a third world war. They want us, nearly fucking closed the book there, they want us to get used to the idea of the outcome of NATO's actions. It's because I nearly closed the book. I've gone and fucked up where I am. They want us to get used to the idea of a new war, a third world war. So Gorbachev and Putin were both warning of the outcome of NATO's actions. And the current president of the USA was showing in 1997 that the oligarchy know exactly how to provoke a war with Russia. The oligarchy deliberately and methodically continued for decades down a road they knew would draw Russia into World War III. Why? It can bubble. It can only be their plan for how to remove beyond the implosion of the money bubble. Why else would they willingly or knowingly bring about World War III over Ukraine? The most corrupt country in Europe, not a member of NATO, not even a member of the EU. Turkey, a NATO member, has been asking to join the EU since 1987 and is continually thwarted. It's not even as if Ukraine is a democracy, since President Zelensky's Ukraine, controlled by National Socialists since 2014, has to date banned 19 political parties, censored the media and internet sites, banned the Russian language, has completed a ban on the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which had been there since 988 AD, banned elections as well. Under the constitution of Ukraine, Zelensky is not even the president anymore. Is it any wonder that Zelensky constantly appears in military uniform as Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin did? Even during World War II, it was rare to see Churchill in military uniform. Provoking war with Russia via Ukraine is just part of the oligarchy's grand geopolitical scheming. Do you think the oligarchy will give the public in Britain a vote on going to war? Tweedledee and Tweedledum will both agree on declaring war. Once in World War III, there'll be no elections. Those who look to stop the war will be treated as traitors. In 2023, before World War III has officially been declared, in London public meetings to discuss what was going on in Ukraine could not be held because of threats of violence against the venues. The oligarchy are more repressive now than they were in the time of Orwell. In the unpublished preface to Animal Farm in 1945, Orwell once pointed out that questioning the war during World War II was permitted. Where will the oligarchy have you or your descendants fight World War III? Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, probably all three. The European stage began in 2014. Perhaps the Middle East stage began on the 7th of October 2023, and the Asian stage is probably a year or two away. They are moving forward to this huge conflict incrementally, as the West has been in a rollercoaster managed economy since World War I. When the massive money printing from 2009 onwards failed, it was clear that the oligarchy would need something huge and cataclysmic to move society onto the next level of oligarchical control. The planning for World War III was probably underway by 2008. If you don't believe they are capable of this kind of global scheming, we'd refer you to Brzezinski's 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. Eurasia is thus the chessboard on which the struggle for global primacy continues to be played. He cites the pivotal 1904 work of Harold Mackinder, a British geopolitical expert from the time of the British Empire. Who rules East Europe commands the heartlands. He who rules the heartlands commands the world island. He who rules the world island commands the world. Eurasia is the single landmass continent, the world island, which stretches from Portugal's Lisbon to the south of India, to the north of Sweden, and to Vladivostok in Russia. Brzezinski, who was Bill Clinton's strategic advisor in citing Mackinder, goes on to say, in precisely the context laid out by the British Empire, and I quote, "The expansion of NATO is essential. That failure would discredit American leadership. It would shatter the concept of an expanding Europe. It would demoralize the Central Europeans, and it would reignite current dormant or dying Russian geopolitical aspirations in Central Europe." End quote. We ordinary people just cannot conceive of the timescale and geographic scale on which the oligarchy manipulate people and events. All they have to do is gradually put their pieces in play in advance over a period of years or decades and arrange for their mercenaries, the academics, the journalists, and the charities, to provide distracting narratives so the electorate do nothing to derail the plans of the oligarchy. Is it any wonder that the public cannot understand why the EU leaders, vassals of the USA, behave as they do? Is no one surprised that in Germany it's the Greens, the pro-environment pacifists, who are the most gung-ho for war with Russia and the destruction of the life of the animals and plants in Europe? The virtual signalling is just another distraction. What ex-Trotskyist James Burnham was telling the public was, don't pay attention to their words, the virtue signalling, pay attention to their actions. Words are cheap and soon forgotten. Sorry, I'm getting distracted because I've got a friend who's asking me about this book. Did you notice Greta Thunberg not screeching at the UN when NATO blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? Greta and her handlers know not to cross the oligarchy. The oligarchy in the West have understood for decades what the buttons they could push to provoke Russia into military action. So they have been steadily pushing those buttons. Just consider what happened after Obama's 2014 US-backed up coup in Ukraine. The Ukrainian National Socialist regime spent the following 8 years bombing their own citizens in the east of Ukraine because those Ukrainian citizens spoke Russian and they refused to recognize that the US-EU coup in Ukraine produced a democratically elected government for Ukraine. Sorry. Anyway, let's consider that in the context of other countries to see how shameless was the silence of the institutions in the West. Considering the following hypothetical scenarios. So, just bear with me a second. I'm going to check if there are any more on this one. Yeah, there's one more. Okay, so there are going to be 4 scenarios come up in a moment. They're all in bullet points, so it's just a matter of I'll point out point 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and you imagine those scenarios. In Ireland, the Protestants in the north refused to recognise a coup in Dublin, so the regime in Dublin spends 8 years bombing and killing the citizens of Northern Ireland. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2. The people of Catalonia refuse to recognise the government in Madrid, so the regime in Madrid spends 8 years shelling and killing the people in Catalonia. Point number 3. In the USA, the people of Texas say that the 2020 election was stolen by electoral fraud by the Democratic Party. So Joe Biden's government spends 8 years bombing and killing the citizens of Texas. And finally, point 4. In Israel, terrorists from Gaza's butcher hundreds of Israelis, including women and babies. And Israel spends 8 years shelling and killing the people in Gaza. Would you expect the hand-wringing liberals and human rights advocates in the West to keep quiet? Of course not. But they kept quiet about what was happening in Donbass, as Orwell showed with the trouble he had in getting Animal Farm published. The intellectuals simply obey the oligarchy. Perhaps you don't believe that the Kiev regime is being run by National Socialists after all. The oligarchy tells you that it is Russian propaganda. Russia invaded Donbass, eastern Ukraine bordering of Russia, after 8 years of Russia looking for a negotiated solution. The Minsk I Agreement, 2014, and Minsk II Agreements, 2015, brokered by Germany's PM Merkel and France's stroke number 2 by France's President Holland, were fake. Where am I? Just meant to buy time while the West funneled money and weapons and training to Ukraine's Nazis-controlled state. In 2022, Merkel and Hollande separately admitted the Minsk agreements were fake, just delaying tactics. And from 2022, the EU and the UK blocked Russian TV and Russian news websites so that the people of the West could not find what the Russian point of view was. Remember the parable of the elephant and the village of the blind, where basically you've got an elephant being led into the village of the blind and they're all feeling different parts of the elephant. And the oligarchy are basically trying to stop you from touching that specific part of the elephant and describing what that's like. Anywho, where were we? Remember the powerful elephant blind. As the march to World War III increases, your understanding of the situation is deceitfully managed and channeled by the oligarchy. In 2022, when Russian military action occurred, when we saw the oligarchy say Nazis running Ukraine is Russian propaganda, alarm bells sounded. Having seen more than a decade of any dissident in the West being labelled Nazi or far right or racist, we become attuned to looking at details. And in 2022, we knew that from 2014 onwards, many Western news media had been reporting on the actual strength of National Socialism in Ukraine. Now in 2022, they were suddenly silent on this, or worse, they denied it. Moreover, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, a world-class diplomat, has recently said that Russia will not trust any agreements with NATO countries for at least a generation, due to the deception, hypocrisy, and malice of the Western governments. The West has lied, provoked civil war, abandoned diplomacy, stolen property, trained National Socialist armies, destroyed a peace deal. The West is doing all it can to ensure World War III occurs. We'd provide you with links to articles about all this from Russia Today, but we can't, as the liberal democracies have all found underhand ways to block these channels and internet sites so the voters can't see what the oligarchy are up to. To attempt to bypass such censorship in liberal democracies, you could try to access RT using a VPN that will make your internet access appear to be outside the fake liberal democracy of the West. Another tool is to use the Brave web browser with its private windows, which can use the TOR network as an ad hoc VPN. If the oligarchy did not systematically deceive the public, there would be no need for such censorship and no need to find ways around it. The oligarchy in the UK don't even come out and tell the public this website is banned. Instead, that they use deceitful measures to simply stop the website from loading in your browser. They revoke the security certificate used by RT.com, so HTTPS URLs no longer work. The fascist behaviour of liberal democracies is often cunningly concealed to enable the government's paid anti-fascists to pretend that the threat from fascism is elsewhere than to be found in our own government. But of course the mainstream media won't tell you this. You know the drill, folks, because say it with me. It doesn't suit the narrative. We can prove to you that a decade before Russia invaded Ukraine to stop Ukraine from killing their own citizens, at a high political level, the National Socialists of Ukraine were being denounced in the West. In 2012, the European Parliament stated their racist, anti-Semitic and xenophobic views goes against the EU's fundamental values and principles. In 2015, US Congress representatives created an amendment to the House Defense Appropriations Bill that limits arms, training and other assistance to the neo-Nazi Ukrainian militia, the Azov Battalion. It passed by a unanimous vote, but the Pentagon got the amendment removed. The Jerusalem Post commented in 2016 on Congress removing this amendment, pointing out that the Azov Battalion used the neo-Nazi wolf's angel symbol. That wasn't the only report from the Jerusalem Post about National Socialists in Ukraine. Local Jews in shock after Ukrainian city of Konotop elects neo-Nazi mayor in 2015. But by 2022, when members of the Azov Battalion visited Israel, the oligarchy news media in Israel simply described them as controversial. That 22 news report has a photo captioned, "Servicemen from the Azov Volunteer Battalion hold a Ukrainian flag during a ceremony before being sent to eastern Ukraine in Kiev, Ukraine on August 17th, 2015. AP photo, Ephraim Lukatsky. The caption doesn't tell their Jewish readers that the logo on the shirt in the centre of the photo is that of the Svoboda Party, which was being denounced by Western news media and EU politicians as neo-Nazi in 2015. The oligarchy gaslight the public, shifting the narrative, with the Times of Israel telling news in 2022 that, and I quote, "Many saw the unit as a far-right organisation that used Nazi imagery and attracted anti-Semitic nationalists. The unit has featured prominently in Russian accusations that the government in Kiev has Nazi sympathies. In 2017, anti-Semitic graffiti as well as the symbol of the Azov Regiment was sprayed on Odessa's Jewish institutions. Vyacheslav Lekaichov, I don't know how I managed to pronounce that correctly first time. A Russia-born Israeli who monitors hate crimes in Ukraine acknowledges that there were neo-Nazis among the group's founders in 2014, but says the most far-right ideologues left by the end of the year. End quote. Many saw proud National Socialists with SS tattoos and insignia and swastikas painted on their helmets. But don't believe your lying eyes. They're not really Nazis, they're just anti-Slav. To the oligarchy of the West National Socialists are welcome allies, provided the Nazis are anti-Slav rather than anti-Jewish. The ideologues were supposedly promoted out of the Azov battalion, or they learned to keep quiet so the West could square the circle. Nazis in the West are the enemy, but Nazis in Ukraine are allies we fund and weaponize. In 2024, a decade after the National Socialists had supposedly been removed from Ukraine, the Ukrainian soldiers being trained by Germany, France and Canada were still being exposed for their SS tattoos and insignia. And for some reason this doesn't worry the oligarchy in Israel, because the oligarchy of NATO have presumably assured Israel, don't worry, the National Socialists in Ukraine are covert army, they are doing our bidding. Just a year after this Israeli newspaper seemed unconcerned about Ukraine's National Socialists, the Liberal Democrats of the West would be giving the SS a standing ovation in Parliament and describing the Azov Battalion as heroes who grace the liberal democracy of the West. Remember, the oligarchy have only one principle, namely to increase their power and riches. The National Socialists in Ukraine were not some tiny fringe movement or group, but were instrumental in the US-sponsored coup there in 2014, and in 2016, the famous Hollywood director Oliver Stone, director of the movies JFK, Platoon, Natural Born Killers, Born on the 4th of July, made a documentary about the coup in Kiev. For years, this documentary had been hosted on platforms such as YouTube, but suddenly, when Russia responded militarily to 8 years of Russian-speaking Ukrainians being bombed, his documentary was banned on such platforms. History was being rewritten, just as Orwell had seen in the 1930s and the 1940s. Stone's documentary showed what happened in the US coup in Ukraine, which is why the oligarchy attempt to stop you from watching the documentary. We recommend you watch it. Before 2022, across all major Western news outlets, there were many news reports on these National Socialists. For over a decade before 2022, the news media in the West were saying what Putin said in March 2022 when he addressed the Russian people, a speech that the oligarchy in the West ensured that you would not hear. There is a problem with National Socialists in Ukraine. Appendix 5 is a timeline of some of the videos that are still up on YouTube. And you can watch how the oligarchy shifts the narrative. From 2009 to 2021, Ukraine had a Nazi problem. But once Putin says Russia has invaded the east of Ukraine to stop the Nazis bombing and killing Russian speakers, the oligarchy changes the narrative and says there is no problems with Nazis in Ukraine. As Orwell would say in 1984, the past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. If the oligarchy couldn't keep the masses in the groove of the gramophone mind, these new YouTube videos on YouTube would have been deleted. That these videos showing years of Western media exposing Nazis in Ukraine are still available on YouTube shows how confident the oligarchy are that the public will remain in their gramophone minds, only thinking what the media tells them to think. The oligarchy knows that the vast majority of the people will simply let the broadcast media brainwash them with propaganda, so that the public can't even see when the narrative has been switched. Remember the COVID scamdemic? March 2020, masks don't work. Then, by July 2020, it was wear a mask or you can't leave the house. How many people in 2020 said, hey, that's the opposite of what you were saying just a couple of months ago? In our experience, virtually no one noticed his narrative switch, or this narrative switch rather. So the COVID pandemic proved to the oligarchy that they can have near total control of what the public thinks. The oligarchy have ensured that for the vast majority of people in the West, subjected to at least a decade of compulsory education in school, subjected to a barrage of movies about World War II and the Holocaust, the public has one dominant point of historical reference. National Socialism is bad. Of course, the oligarchy used the shorthand Nazism rather than let the public see the connection between welfare state socialism and Hitler's Socialist German Workers' Party. Given this magnetic north of Nazism is bad, a reference point around which the oligarchy can pivot public opinion, the oligarchy can defame an anti-Nazi like Tommy Robinson, or idea that those opponents of the oligarchy are supporters of National Socialism. But when the real supporters of National Socialism are literally killing people in Ukraine, the oligarchy in the West pretend the killers in Ukraine are not National Socialists, arranging for a Jewish comedian puppet, Zelensky is an actor who came to fame by playing the character of the President of Ukraine in a TV show, to be the leader of the country where the National Socialists exert control. Zelensky now plays the role of the actual president, but really it's the National Socialists and the oligarchy of the USA who are in charge of Ukraine. Until this weekend in 2019, when he became President, Zelensky's main experience in politics was playing a school teacher who becomes the president in a satirical television program. He ran with no party affiliation. Until 2 days before voting began, he had no clear team of expert advisors, not even on foreign policy and national security. The president's key constitutional responsibilities, he not only traded on the image of a complete outsider, he also did not know face-to-face campaigning, made no speeches, held no rallies, eschewed travel across the country, gave no press conferences, avoided in-depth interviews with independent journalists, and, until the last day of campaigning, did not debate. But before he ran for office, Zelensky was omnipresent in UK's most popular TV network, 1+1, filling hours of weekly programming with his variety shows, comedy talent contests, and his series about an outsider elected president. The construction of Zelensky as head of the most corrupt country in Europe is hidden from the public in the West. Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine specifically on a platform of bringing peace between Ukrainians, including those who are Russian speakers, and with Russia. When Volodymyr Zelensky sought to become Ukraine's president, he stood on a platform of peace. Zelensky promised to sit down with Vladimir Putin and to reach a deal with Russia. He would end the unpopular war in the east, the Donbass, and concentrate on important domestic reforms. Those included ridding the country of corruption and oligarchs. In 2019, Zelensky also opposed the banning use of the Russian language in Ukraine. But like the other policies, the reverse of this was actually what happened. Imagine the outrage in Britain if all Arabic and Urdu Qurans were banned. Zelensky proceeded to ban a dozen opposition parties, ban TV stations, and when his presidency expired, he continued to parade around at international conferences as president in spite of the constitutional laws of Ukraine. By 2024, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology was reporting that only 5% of Ukrainians think this is stroke number 3, that Zelensky has fulfilled his election promises, with 25% thinking he hasn't fulfilled a single promise. Under Zelensky, a decree was issued making it illegal for Ukraine to negotiate with Putin. The oligarchy in the West want to make sure they get World War III, since Putin's popularity in Russia varies between 89 and 59% approval. By contrast, the approval ratings of the leaders of USA, UK, Canada, France, Germany vary between a high of 37% and an abysmal low of 5%. Is it any wonder that the people of the West have such contempt for the fraudulent democratically elected leaders? Ironically, when organizations close to Ukraine discuss Zelensky's rise to power, they discuss the oligarchs in Ukraine who backed him. They also point out that 75% of the Ukrainian parliament consists of young, inexperienced people who had never before been elected, saying this puts total power in Zelensky's hands. And of course, the oligarchy and the National Socialists. However, the European Council on Foreign Relations admitted that amongst all these inexperienced people enthralled to the TV star, Arsen Avakov was retained as the head of the Interior Ministry. The Interior Ministry has become its own personal empire since 2014, allegedly providing a krisha, protective roof, for organised crime and far-right militias. The corruption and the far-right militias were never far from the Ukrainian government, or the new one that is. With the untold billions flowing into Ukraine, we can be sure those oligarchs, Ukrainian, American and European, are creaming off huge profits. In 2021, the Pandora Papers, a project by an international consortium of journalists, exposed the secret offshore funds of the global elite. The Ukrainian president may have pledged to reform the country's corrupt system of politics, but the Pandora's Papers tell a different story. Ukraine is the country with the highest number of politicians named in the leak of offshore data, which implicates hundreds of people linked to offshore companies, including President Volodymyr Zelensky. In electing Zelensky, Ukrainians did not vote for war with Russia at the time of the election in 2019. In 2019, a Ukrainian expert at the Atlantic Control think tank says the conflict with Russia is not at all a factor in this election campaign at all. But the oligarchy are always scheming and putting their pawns in place to fulfill their plans, not those of the masses. The oligarchy got their puppet elected and then they told him what to do. As Appendix 5 shows, in the years before 2022, the media in the West warned the world about the problem with National Socialists in Ukraine, but only when this served some other purpose in the West, that is, the talk of the threat of the far right in the West. Once these National Socialists are put into military action against Russian speakers in Ukraine, then the oligarchy simply get us to direct our attention to another limb of the elephant. What I said earlier. So basically, what they're trying to do is you're trying to feel one part of the elephant, and if it's the part that they don't want you to listen to feel in on and actually understand, they'll direct you and push you towards another part of the elephant. So, Russia banned for 4 years to include 2020 Olympics and 2022 World Cup, and that was 2019. Putin is a war criminal and should be treated as such, 2022. Eurovision chief says Russia ban stands for ultimate values of democracy, 2022. War crimes, what I like to do on Lethal Company. Anyway, war crimes, EU Parliament to debate the ICC arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, 2023. Putin arrest warrant issued over war crime allegations, 2023. Putin is a dictator and a tyrant, 2024. Tucker Carlson could face sanctions for assisting war criminal, 2024. So all these distraction techniques. What is important to remember about the segments from TV news listed in the chronological order in Appendix 5 is that such program segments are not simply written up and posted to a news website in a few hours. They will take days or weeks to make, requiring the investment of journalist, script editor, producer, camera operator, video editor, where did that come from? Video editor, rather, and translator, etc., etc. The news companies would go to this trouble and expense because they plan these things to be beamed into the homes of millions of passive viewers and consequently shape the perceptions of the maximum number of viewers, rather than news articles sought out on some obscure part of a news website. We are fortunate for the purposes of analysis that news organizations left these old broadcasts on YouTube for so many years, so now we can chart how the oligarchy manipulate the public's perceptions. Clearly, between 2009 and 2022, it was useful for the oligarchy to talk up the threat of the neo-Nazis in Europe and the USA in an effort to herd the public into bovine compliance with the oligarchy's policy of population replacement. By 2022, the narrative switched to denying there was National Socialists in Ukraine. If you remain unconvinced by how the mainstream media reversed the narrative about Nazis in Ukraine in 2009 to no Nazis in Ukraine, 2022, consider the events in the Parliament of Canada at the end of September 2023. The NATO puppet Zelensky made an unannounced visit to Canada to thank them for their support. While he was there, Zelensky and the entire Canadian Parliament, left and right wing, gave two standing ovations to one of the hundreds of Ukrainian SS officers given sanctuary in Canada after World War II. As the communist news site Morning Star stated, Mr. Hunker was applauded for fighting against the Soviet Red Army with the 1st Ukrainian Division. As the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Galicia, can't even read now, a largely Ukrainian Nazi collaborator unit was renamed in 1945 of March as Germany was on the point of losing the war. Following the incorporation of openly neo-Nazi units like the Azov and the Ida battalions in the Ukrainian military, the incident underlines the way the war is being used to rewrite history and rehabilitate fascist collaborators, while depicting the Soviet Union as the aggressors in World War II. If you really believe that none of the 338 Canadian politicians knew what that the Ukrainians fought against the Soviet Union during World War II, were Ukrainians fighting on the same side as Hitler? What are the politicians doing occupying their seats as democratic elitists? Representatives are supposedly more knowledgeable and more competent than the average person. When the public reaction was horror that hundreds of Democrats applauded a former Waffen-SS officer, the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament resigned. Do you think the Speaker was some illiterate teenager? He has a degree in politics and is approaching retirement age. One of the reasons why Canada's oligarchy didn't get away with this atrocious behaviour is that there was already been a running controversy there about Canada having cemeteries and monuments to the Waffen-SS unit. From Business Insider, and give me a moment here, now a monument honouring stroke number 4, honouring Hunker's unit in Oakville's Street, Volodymyr Ukrainian Cemetery, is under fire again after his appearance made headlines. It's unacceptable to have monuments dedicated to a unit affiliated with the SS because they were complicit in the Holocaust, said Dan Pannerton from the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Emphasis added. Despite the fact that there was already an ongoing controversy over their Waffen-SS officers, having been given asylum in Canada after World War II, and a controversy over monuments to them in Canada, the Canadian MPs nevertheless thought they could take the risk of honouring the SS in the presence of Zelensky. Do you think Jewish Zelensky didn't know who this World War II SS officer was? As we keep stressing, the oligarchy have no principles. As other Canadian writers have pointed out, Canada has a long history of soft-peddling the Ukrainian Waffen-SS. Moreover, in the years just before the Parliament saluted the Waffen-SS, there has been outrage in Canada due to the Ukrainian soldiers in 2022, where there were multiple incidents where Canadian websites were shocked that the Canadian military was training Ukrainian soldiers in Canada who were avowed National Socialists, and the training of such people is still going on in Germany in the middle of 2024. Despite Canada presenting itself as the virtue signalling apex of leftist dementia, there's a much wider context to this contemporary scandal of them turning a blind eye to Ukrainian National Socialists. The decision to admit Ukrainian immigrants who had served in the SS Waffen Division in the post-war was contentious, with Jewish groups arguing that they should be barred from the country. The International Military Tribunal, stroke number 5, International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg declared the SS to be a criminal organization. Man alive. Including the SS Waffen in that declaration. The Waffen-SS Galicia Division surrendered to the British Army in 1945, and just over 8,000 men were moved to the United Kingdom in 1947. In 1950, the Federal Cabinet decided to allow Ukrainians living in the UK to come to Canada, notwithstanding their service in the German army, provided they were otherwise admissible. These Ukrainians should be subject to special security screening, but should not be rejected on the grounds of their service in the German army. In 1985, then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney called for a royal commission to examine whether Canada had become a haven for war criminals. The Deschênes Commission found that there were 600 former members of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division living in Canada at the time. Consider the 50,000 Google hits attempting to smear Tommy Robinson as far-right and Nazi and fascist. Now consider that World War II and Nazism are probably the only single ideological frame of reference shared by people in the West. Yet, you know nothing about the UK and Canadian governments sheltering thousands of the Waffen-SS after World War II. When it suits the oligarchy, Nazism is evil. At other times, they are importing known National Socialist soldiers, sheltering them, training them, and funding them. Likewise, Islamist terrorism is evil, but Islam is the religion of peace. The oligarchy manipulates phrases and slogans for the convenience, or for political convenience. The oligarchy have no principles. When we first encountered writers showing evidence that the oligarchy in the West had deployed jihadists as covert warriors for the West, we were shocked by the idea. But seeing them do this with the avowed National Socialists, the claims about covert jihadi armies used by the West no longer seems unlikely. And that will be all for today's book. 40 minutes practically on the dot. Page 232 is where we're going to be continuing off from, pretty much right at the top. But yes, quite a lot to say as far as importing all these National Socialists. I think there's a lot of explaining to do as far as Canada's concerned. And yet they want to sit here and libelously slander ordinary patriots like you and me as far right, or Tommy Robinson as far right, or Nazi. I think it should be clear to see for everyone now who the real Nazis truly are.